discerning the spirits, and praying the scriptures. Would you pray with us? Here's Dr. Chaps.
Welcome back to the Western Conservative Summit. I'm joined now by Ambassador John Bolton. Needs no introduction. Here you are, sir. Welcome to Colorado.
Glad to be here.
So why'd you come to Colorado this time? I know you've been many times, but what's going on?
Well, I think the Western Conservative Summit is a big event. I think it's particularly important now, 6 months into the Trump administration, Republican control of Congress. For people to evaluate where we are, I'm going to focus on national security issues, of course. And I think one of the lessons we've learned is it's one thing to win elections, it's another thing to govern effectively. And so we've got a lot of issues at the moment. I think it's important as conservatives we talk about that and talk about the best way to continue to advance our objectives.
So I know your name was on the short list for Secretary of State, and ultimately God had other plans. But what are you doing now?
Well, I'm at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm a Fox News contributor. I practice law. I do a lot of different things. And, you know, this is an opportunity, I think, when you're not in government but in the public debate to make a contribution as well. And so I'm delighted to be able to do that.
Do you have any specific comments about the Trump administration's foreign policy, particularly as it pertains to immigration and Islam?
Well, I think the President's made it clear he has a very different view of the terrorist threat that the United States faces. And I think it starts with the recognition that indeed it's an ideology, that we're not faced with individual lone wolf decisions to become a terrorist. There are people who affirmatively hate what the United States stands for, the West more broadly, and wants to see it destroyed. So by refocusing our efforts on dealing with this hostile ideology, I think ultimately we'll be in much better shape to protect ourselves. Discretion in determining who can get into the United States. These are subjects appropriately committed to the political branches of government. This is the essence of sovereignty, determining who comes in and who becomes a citizen. There are appropriate areas for judicial review, but determining entrance into the United States is not one of them. This is a core foreign policy issue. It's committed to the President. Congress has recognized that. So what the Supreme Court should do is uphold the President's authority. Whether it will or not remains to be seen, and it's one reason why elections have consequences. If the President gets more chances to pick Supreme Court justices, and he will certainly have ample opportunity to pick lower court judges, this is going to make a critical difference for the future of the country.
During World War II, the United States banned certain nationalities, for example Germans, from having easy access to immigration to Americans. But you know, the Democrats under FDR never said that was a racist policy. Do you think it is or is not, I don't know what the right word is, but inappropriate for certain countries that have a majority Muslim population to be prohibited, the 7 countries named in Trump's order, from having open immigration to the United States?
Well, I think you focus on what the problem is and try and devise solutions to protect the country from the problem. If you have people who want to come into the country from a drug-producing, drug-exporting area, it is legitimate to treat applicants for entry there in a somewhat different way, because they are bringing potentially a problem with them. If you have applicants for admission to the country from a disease-ridden area, it's perfectly appropriate for public health and safety reasons to have different standards. It's not directed against the religion, it's directed against the problem, which is terrorism. Now, you want to make your standards as tight and narrow as you can to fit the problem, because we do believe in free trade and openness where we can have it. But let's face it, an applicant for entry from Syria is not the same as an applicant for entry from Iceland. That's a fact. I didn't make that fact. The President didn't make that fact, but that's the reality. The President is granted discretion by the Constitution to deal with the reality, and it's really up to him, working with Congress, to make that choice.
The President promised, or at least campaigned on, the idea of building a border wall in Mexico, and so far not one foot of fence has been built, but I saw recently that Congress may be appropriating $1.8 billion to begin that fence. Any chances that'll get through the Senate, and do you see any construction beginning before the midterm elections?
Well, I've seen projections that construction would begin. It won't necessarily be the wall, I think, that some people envisioned. But the fact is the President's stated policies have already had a dramatic impact on the efforts of illegal immigrants to come across the border. We've seen others who are here actually leaving. The efforts at law enforcement to arrest people who are here illegally has dramatically increased. So it just goes to show if you simply have a president who enforces the law, it can make an enormous difference.
Last question. I know you're pressed for time, and thank you for this interview. President Trump recently traveled to Europe. He was there for, I think there was a 20-nation summit. But after that summit, it was reported that the United States maybe opposed having open trade, and in fact Europe signed a new trade deal with Japan that the United States was not party to. Do you think the President's trade policies are going in the right direction, or protecting American jobs, or maybe hurting free trade?
Well, I think the President's clear. He believes in free trade. He just believes when the United States enters into an agreement, whether it's a bilateral agreement or a multilateral agreement, he expects the other countries that are party to it to adhere to their word. We adhere to our commitment in treaties. I can tell you, from my experience, there is no country in the world that's more scrupulous than the United States. When we make an international agreement, we follow it. And what the President's saying is other people should follow theirs, and we should look at these agreements and make sure Americans are treated fairly. So I find that very hard to object to in principle, and I think it's already had an effect on the minds of many of our trading partners for their good and for us as well.
Where can people learn more or follow your content?
Well, I'm at AEI.org. Each scholar has a page there, so you can go to mine. You can also go to BoltonPAC.com to see the work I'm doing in a PAC and a super PAC to help support candidates who believe in a strong national security policy.
Thank you, sir. You're a hero to many, and I'm in that crowd.
Well, I appreciate it. Glad to be with you.
All right. That's Ambassador John Bolton. I'm Dr. Chaps. We'll be right back. Today I want to invite you to sign an important petition to Congress to protect military chaplains, especially their right to pray publicly in Jesus' name. If you remember my story, you know that I was vindicated by Congress in 2006 after I took a principled stand for the right to pray in Jesus' name. But Congress never did pass a positive law to let chaplains pray according to their conscience. Would you sign that petition with me? Let's take action today.
Defending your religious freedom. Here is Dr. Chaps.
Welcome back. Dr. Chaps, joined by one of our favorite returning guests, honestly. This man knows his stuff. Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security Policy. Frank, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
So you are a national security expert. You've been on our show many times. You've been an advisor at times to the Trump administration, although you're not in the Trump administration right now. You know all the players, and you've been interacting with them probably for years. What is your assessment of President Trump? How are the first 6 months of his administration going?
Well, let me just say, for the record, I've not been an advisor formally to the president or his team. There was an interesting stir shortly after the transition began where it was announced that I was, but it was untrue. I have friends who work for him, and I have, of course, been talking to them informally. And I probably don't know all of the players, but I know enough to be very, very persuaded that Donald Trump has a problem with the swamp that is inside his own administration now, not simply elsewhere in official Washington. And the trouble with that is that I believe it has made infinitely more difficult not only the conduct of his policies, particularly the ones he ran on, but even the articulation of them. Let me give you an example. Shortly after he made, I think, an unfortunate choice of a lieutenant general by the name of H.R. McMaster as his national security advisor, General McMaster had a staff meeting of the National Security Council staff. And his first comment out of the box, apparently, was, "I don't agree with the use of the term radical Islamic terrorism," which just happens to be the term that the President of the United States had explicitly said is what he thinks we need to use to describe this phenomenon. I prefer, frankly, the term Sharia supremacism, but whatever you call it.
This was a big problem.
You can't have that from one of your subordinates right out of the box.
You're absolutely right. During the Obama administration, the president was afraid, his staff was afraid to ever use the phrase radical Islamic terrorist. And I think Hannity started calling people out on that and made it a presidential campaign issue. Donald Trump promised, in fact swore, that he would use that term, radical Islamic terrorist. And now his top advisor is going the other way? Is McMaster sort of an Obama light?
Well, he got 3 stars under Obama. He was a colonel early in the Obama administration who was passed over for with Sharia. There's not a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, sort of right on down the line.
And he got promoted to 3-star general.
He got 3 stars out of the deal.
Wow.
Now, he had an impressive career, to be fair, as a tank commander in a battle many years ago in Desert Storm. He's written a very impressive book about politicization of the military, about Vietnam, which is all the more ironic because that's, I think, frankly, what he's now doing as the National Security Advisor, trying to sort of carry forward this misbegotten and dangerous policy that the Obama administration had. I call it see no Sharia.
If you're watering down the language, you're also watering down the national security policy.
You are, as I say, undermining the national security policy. You're rendering it incoherent. And worst of all, what's perceived as you do that by our enemies, they don't think of it as political correctness or diversity sensitivity or multiculturalism or any of these other fancy terms we use to excuse it. They think of it as submission. And as you know, submission is what Islam is all about. And
Islamists want us to submit.
Ensuring that the infidel submits to the Sharia adherent Islam.
So if McMaster made that comment in one of his early meetings, has that translated into his national security policy, or did Trump correct him on the spot and say, no, you do that again and you're fired, Mr. McMaster? Is there any accountability from the president to his advisor?
I don't know their secret conversations. I will tell you that the president continues to use that term, including just the other day. This is, I think, evidence, though, of a certain dysfunctionality within his administration, because it is equally clear that his chief aide in the national security space still doesn't agree with him. In fact, I was told the other day that General McMaster has actually gone so far as to say that the people who don't agree with the president, who worked for the man whose course he tried to correct, namely Barack Obama, are not holdovers, though they're still on his staff. Now they're part of the Trump team. Well, I'm sorry, no, actually not. And similarly, I think on this Iran deal and on Qatar and on, well, designation of the Muslim Brotherhood, there's simply a disconnect between what the president has said he wants to do, what he espouses, and what McMaster and, frankly, some others in the government are actively seeking to do.
Well, one thing I admire about Frank Gaffney is his courage to come on this show and name names. Although he is an advisor, I believe, to the Trump administration, he's not afraid to call out those people who are part of the problem. And McMaster is one name. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I think we're going to talk about Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State. More with Frank Gaffney after this.
Giving you a megaphone in Washington, D.C. Dr. Chaps will be right back.
Today I want to invite you to sign an important petition to Congress to protect military chaplains, especially their right to pray publicly in Jesus' name. If you remember my story, you know that I was vindicated by Congress in 2006 after I took a principled stand for the right to pray in Jesus' name. But Congress never did pass a positive law to let chaplains pray according to their conscience. Would you sign that petition with me? Let's take action today.
This is PIJN News.
Welcome back. Dr. Chaps here, joined again by Frank Gaffney, who is a national security expert. Frank, mention your website where people can get copies of your books and learn about your policy.
The easiest one to remember is securefreedom.org. We are very pleased to have people download for free well over a dozen books that we've published there online. They are, I think, among the most important resources that you can find if you're interested in learning the truth. Was his from the city of Mecca to a little town called Medina. And Muslims ever since have been following in his footsteps to spread the faith through migration or immigration, or other ways of thinking of this are colonization or even invasion. And when you see those millions of immigrants, many of them notably military-aged, unaccompanied males, making the migration to Europe, that is an invasion. And we're watching it play out in real time what it means for their societies. And the point is, if you don't like what you're seeing in Europe now, which is essentially an insurgency, it's not just random acts of terrorism or even the widespread practice of rape in many of these countries, or molesting and other horrors for women. It's an insurgency. If you don't like what's happening to Europe, we better take steps to prevent it from happening here by, among other things, stopping the importing of more jihadists.
Well, you think the Department of Homeland Security, the INS would have pretty strong feelings about that. But more broadly, our foreign policy is managed by the State Department. And we've had a problem in that a lot of former Obama holdovers, the bureaucrats, are still deeply embedded within the State Department. And then the president appointed Rex Tillerson. And God bless him, he was a genius businessman with Exxon for all these years. But do you think he's able to tame the bureaucracy that's within the State Department? Who's really running the show? Is it Trump's foreign policy yet, or is it the department's foreign policy that is being pushed upon Rex Tillerson?
Well, it's being pushed on to Rex Tillerson, and through Rex Tillerson, it's being pushed on the president. Look, the State Department is an interesting microcosm of the larger problem we're talking about. You have Rex Tillerson in place, and probably a handful of other people who actually have some attachment to Donald Trump and his policies and his administration. The vast majority of the people in the State Department, foggy bottom they call it, are...
That is the swamp, by the way. I think foggy bottom, they called it that because it is the swamp where the State Department lives.
It is the heart of what was actually physically a swamp initially in the early days of our country. But the point is that that bureaucracy, first of all, has a permanent foreign service. It also has a permanent civil service, but it has also had a bunch of Obama appointees at the political level, and most of them are still there. A case in point. The president the other day was confronted with essentially a coup against his policies towards Iran. Rex Tillerson brought him essentially one option with respect to a major policy choice, which was to certify that Iran is in compliance with this abysmal deal, I call it the Obama bomb deal, and the only choice that the president was given was certifying that they are, in fact, still in compliance. It's not true. The president has recently, just before, seen an op-ed by John Bolton pointing out in a number of different ways why it is not true. In fact, John spoke about them here at the Western Conservative Summit recently. But the point is, when the president discovered that he was once again being presented essentially with a fait accompli, what he had served up 3 months before, he was furious. Because not only had they essentially engineered this kind of fait accompli 3 months before, but he had specifically told them, I want options that will give me a choice to do something other than continue this charade. And he didn't get them. Rex Tillerson denied and ignored that policy direction from the president. So the president has now decided he's going to entrust to a small number of people he does believe have his back inside the White House to do that policy analysis rather than the State Department. But this isn't the way the government should work. The president, the chief executive officer, the commander-in-chief should have the loyal support of his personnel, and this one does not.
Well, if State Department policy is now being written within the White House, because we assume if they're closer to the president, he trusts them to be at that level, and it's not being written at the State Department, that's an indicator the president does not trust the higher level bureaucrats within the State Department to be writing that policy. Why doesn't he replace them? The Plum Book, as you know, 4,000 presidential appointments, has probably 100 State Department jobs. Why doesn't he appoint real good conservatives to take over the State Department and start fighting back against what Obama left behind?
It's an excellent question. First of all, he would have to fire some of the people that he has appointed, and I think he probably is inclined to do that. But second of all, you've got to get good people in. The process that has populated his administration to this point, run by Reince Priebus, the chief of staff of the White House, has, I think, been contributing to his difficulties because some of these appointees have not, in fact, been on the president's side.
And that's where you get all the press leaks against the Trump administration and the Washington Post.
The rest of that bureaucracy. But the second problem is, as you know, the Democrats in Congress, with, I think, frankly, the connivance of some in the Republican leadership in the Senate, have been slow-rolling these appointments of the people the president is trying to bring in.
You mean they're still not confirmed by the U.S. Senate?
Many of them are still not confirmed. The Democrats are insisting on a 30-hour process for every one of these senior appointments, which means if you allow them to do it at their leisure, it can take forever. Mitch McConnell has not started the clock and said, you've got 30 hours, we're not breaking until that time has expired, which drives them to do it rather more quickly.
Yeah.
And it busts up the
McConnell could speed it up, but he has not done that.
He has not done it, and as a result, this president is bleeding out on the personnel front especially.
Well, these are personnel problems.
Personnel is policy, as they say.
Personnel is policy. What is your advice to him? How can the president, let's say he hears this interview, what would you tell, talk to the camera, there's President Trump, what would you advise him, Mr. President?
Mr. President, I would do what you know needs to be done. You made your chops as a reality TV star by firing people. This is a moment when you need to fire a number of people, including, I'm afraid, some of those that you have appointed yourself, because unless and until you do, you don't need to fire them all, but you need to make an example of some of them and the rest of them will get the message. And you need to take the opportunity thereby created to put into place people who want your policies to succeed, who want your presidency to succeed. If you don't make these sorts of changes, that ain't going to happen.
I assume you're on call if he wants to telephone you, or how can anybody, any of your viewers, reach you?
The best way is through our website, securefreedom.org. I think the president knows how to reach me as well. I certainly would be happy to be of advice and counsel to him at any time.
This man should have been running the transition team for the State Department. This is Frank Gaffney, Center for Security Policy, written many books. Your website one more time.
Well, I'm just going to hold one of them up. This is the single most important book ever written, as far as I'm concerned, about the jihad, because it was written by the jihadists. One of the top Muslim Brotherhood operatives is called An Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal of the Group in North America, a secret plan meant not for our eyes, but for the Muslim Brotherhood leadership in Egypt. It's available for free at securefreedom.org. You can also buy the book at Amazon very inexpensively.
Securefreedom.org. Thank you, Frank, for coming on the program again.
It's a pleasure. Good to have a chance
to
do so.
I'm Dr. Chaps. We'll be right back. To those to whom it is due, when it is the power in your hand to do so. God bless you in Jesus' name. We'll see you next time. Today I want to invite you to sign an important petition to Congress to protect military chaplains, especially their right to pray publicly in Jesus' name. If you remember my story, you know that I was vindicated by Congress in 2006 after I took a principled stand for the right to pray in Jesus' name. But Congress never did pass a positive law to let chaplains pray according to their conscience. Would you sign that petition with me? Let's take action today.
Dr. Chaps needs your financial support to stay on the air. Would you please send your best donation today? Please visit prayinjesusname.org to donate online. Or you can mail a check to Pray in Jesus Name Ministries, Post Office Box 7.